Hi, this is Paul. Don't have a lot of time to make a video. Post-war consensus, liberalism, boy, these topics are heating up. Christian, if you haven't listened to, Christian's been putting out content again, Christian Baxter, and some great conversations. He just did a wonderful conversation with Eric Hamilton, who I had spoken with. Really enjoyed that conversation going through it. And now he's got one coming out with Cale Zeldin, Post-World War II Consensus with Cale Zeldin, coming Thursday. And I think, I don't know if he said he might let it out easy because Nate Heil said, I'm about effing done with the TLC today. Nothing but shitty takes all around. And I remember when Jordan Peterson was popping off on Twitter about things, and Nate was popping off about Jordan Peterson popping off on Twitter. So people get frustrated and they sound off, and that's what people do. And but that's sort of, it's interesting, and you sort of know you have built something of a community of trust when it's clear via certain reactions that other people trust Nate, and rightfully so. Nate's a very trustworthy individual. I love Nate a lot. Annie Crawford said, Annie Crawford's done classes in the symbolic world. Haven't had her on. I'm going to have her on for a Randos at some point. But, what happened? The shitstorm of bad takes I can't help but take personally. Anglicans, Bourdain, and me personally catching strays. Everything I checked, every time I checked my phone during a lull in my son's Star Trek game, something I had attached to me personally was getting flamed. But I had good bourbon gaming and barbecue to keep me from getting actually upset, and I'm mostly counter trolling. Oh, there you go. So that's what Nate's doing. But these I imagine this is, and Free really had done a funny meme about J.D. Vance and the Antichrist, and so I imagine that's how fans of J.D. Vance and Hillbilly Elegy feel right now. Hillbilly Elegy was excellent, Nate says, and Vance may turn away from his Sith Lord Master yet. I pray he does. Ethan Cahy, which Sith? Teal or Yarvin? And on and on and on. Again, back to Peugeot in my last conversation with he and Vervaeke about sort of the sacrificial foundation of the post-war consensus. And I've been thinking a lot about this. Obviously the Douthit Peter Thiel conversation going forward. Luke is processing stuff on his channel right now. Wish I could join, but I've got to get a video out. I've been trying to make my way through this video, Has Liberalism Failed? On the Dispatch, where Dr. Jeffrey Collins is kind of going through some history of liberalism. And it was really interesting in terms of this really huge thing we call liberalism. I really did like Sam's definition of it in his conversation with Nate on the idea that there's sort of nothing at the there isn't what is framed as a religion in sort of a religious secular thing, even though a lot of what's happened since postmodernity that people acknowledge, well, there is always a religious frame. Again, my definition of religion, that which is highest and that which gets us to the highest. That's what someone's religion is. So religion is unavoidable, but there's always a religious frame. And so secularism develops. This gets into some of the stuff that I found via Tom Holland about how secularism actually is a development within Christianity. Now here they're debating, there's some of their frustration with Catholic integralists, but
that I think liberalism emerges when there are spaces in civil society for competing interests, right? That's how you get Magna Carta, is because England doesn't have a standing army, and because it doesn't have a standing army, the local nobles are powerful enough to stand up to the king, and so they have to come up with a civic compromise that creates social space for people to live in. And I think that sort of city of God, city of man thing in Christianity in particular is one of those things that creates the concept of the secular society, right? Secularism comes out of it. It's a Christian notion, right?
Absolutely. Do you know the book by Larry Seidentop, The Invention of the Individual?
Yes, yeah.
I mean, he makes a lot of these points. Yeah, no, secularity is, as you point out, I mean, it originally referred to a certain sort of clergyman,
Right.
a non-monastic clergyman who lived in the world, which is what the term means, in the world, in the age. And from that division, which is a division inside of religion itself and inside of a dominant Christianity, you get an echo of the more profound dualisms of Augustine or the scriptures themselves, in which the secular world has fallen and can never achieve uh, uh, salvation, religious perfection, blessedness, however one wants to understand it. But by the same token, the secular has its rightful sphere. And I think it's an incredibly important thing to bear in mind. And I think the integralists would have been far better off to think about their tradition because it has a long life. I mean, if you look into the 19th century, there's a whole kind of pluralist movement. And here we find people like Figgis and so forth. And often was quite Christian in orientation, which was basically kind of an anti-sovereignist movement, wanted to establish the kind of independence of associational life inside of a modern society. They often had churches in mind, but they also had universities and unions and different levels of government. And, these integralists often present themselves as sort of heirs of Tocqueville and Burke and so forth, but I actually think they've kind of pretty much repudiated the lessons there about associational life being importantly independent of the state. There's a kind of sovereignism to them that I think is not consistent with other aspects of the project they want to pursue. But I totally agree with you that, in a lot of ways, religion provides a sort of template for that civil society and state dualism that later gets translated into more secular terms with religion alongside. But there are plenty of critiques of liberalism that it's not comfortable with that, that it constantly wants to invade and imperialize that associational life, that it's comfortable with individual liberties and rights, but it's worried about associational rights. And I think that's a lot of our culture wars, a lot of the bad jurisprudence that came out of the Supreme Court and so forth, represented a liberal anxiety about associational rights to the extent that they look like they might trample or impede individual rights.
So I think that's right.
And I think that's a great point that he makes. And when we're looking at these massive social transitions, I was thinking I want to make a video about sort of these different levels of spiritual activity in the world. When we look at these massive things, oh no, liberals going away, that means that it's very similar to what's going on in the Christian Reformed Church. Oh, we're going to hem in the mandate of the banner. That means that it's going to be one world government in the CRC. And it was, of course, Chong's defense of the unaltered mandate was we need someone to speak truth to power. And so it's just we're processing all of this, but just because we're saying there needs to be adjustments, we're learning some things about how things have rolled out, doesn't mean that everything that was brought in goes out the window. And this again I see directly applied in the Christian Reformed Church when I look at the millennials and the younger generation of the Christian Reformed Church that is basically now assuming power. They're not the kinds of first generation, 2.0 generation Dutch immigrants in America. They don't have sort of they don't have a lot of the racism built into them that Dutchmen sort of picked up in America in these ghettoized situations. I mean, it's not that they're simply going to be anti-Semitic and racist because of these other things. And again, it doesn't mean that there isn't real anti-Semitism and real racism out there. But there's a lot of concern because, again, we tend to see two things, one against the other. And again, it's interesting in this when they're talking about associative rights of association, rights not only that I can have independent conviction with respect to thought and religion and speech. Those are important liberal rights, which I continue to believe need to be maintained, but also freedom of association for groups. But there's going to have to be some larger container. And of course, I would say that the larger container in which liberalism sort of achieved its status in the West was a Christian container, and in many respects it was a Protestant container, and it was provoked because of pluralism within Protestant groups that forced the larger group to have a certain degree of secularism and pluralism in that group. And I think, I agree with Sam and Nate that these things are, of tremendous importance. And again, it was very interesting listening to Peter Thiel when he says, so often the instinctive move that we make is sort of this one world government, and you almost hear underneath that sort of a totalitarian posture, that we need this totalitarian posture in order to stay safe, or that everyone will be safe. And this, of course, is this illiberalism that arose during, the rise of the woke, that, as Nate said at the beginning of his conversation with Sam, in many ways, this little corner arose because of illiberal activities that Jordan Peterson and others were calling out, and Jordan Peterson sort of broke some things open. I don't know if Rod said it or not, if it was within what we taped when we taped that conversation with Bethel, but he was talking to me about a conversation he was having with Jonathan Peugeot, because Jonathan Peugeot is a little bit frustrated because he would like to be able to have some impact in the French language world, in Quebec and in France, because he's a natural French speaker, and he isn't. And I don't remember if it was Dreer or someone else that made the observation, but the French didn't have Peterson. Peterson was sort of like fracking in a way. He sort of busted things up so that new things could kind of emerge. And so when I look at Peter Thiel sort of wrestling with our imagination of the Antichrist, and he notes something that I really didn't see it as clearly as when he noted it, that, so many of these ideas are so globalist, governmental, totalitarian. I've never been a big, unlike Luke, never read the Left Behind series, and so I've always sort of dismissed dispensationalists as sort of, not dispensationalists, but a lot of dispensational eschatology as not worthy of a lot of attention with mine. But of course, there's this big anxiety because of what's in the book of Revelation about one world government. Now, what I really wanted to talk about is this video just came out from Like Stories of Old about the death of Hollywood's liberal fantasies. There's really a bunch of very interesting things in here. Now, in the past, I've had difficulty sort of replaying his clips because he has music and a bunch of other stuff in there. And well, let's just try so. Let's see how it goes.
What's going on? We've got misinformation blurring the line between fact and fiction. At free trial. Here's how we're going to solve all of the world's problems, according to Hollywood. First, let's see what's going on. We've got misinformation blurring the line between fact and fiction.
And of course, I mean, I loved how he framed this because he's exactly right, because in some ways this is sort of the blue church methodology. And when I listen to people who are deep in the blue church, this is what I hear. They, of course, know the truth, but the people watching the wrong network or listening to the wrong channels or getting the wrong information, they're being deceived. And so what they really need to do is, well, set the world right. It's too bad, that pesky First Amendment, that we can't shut all those other things down.
How do we even talk to each other?
There's also a resurgence of bigotry, of populism, there's international tension, civil unrest, and not to forget... Okay, that's some pretty serious...
Now, I didn't see that Marvel movie. Is that the president turned into the Hulk, or a bad Hulk because he's red instead of green? I don't know, but I'm just going to play along.
Serious challenges. Now what do we do? Well, here's the secret. You just give a rousing speech.
What is it you think we're fighting?
We're Americans. What are we doing?
Let no more blood be spilt in the name of tyranny.
But I think you're trying to change. Now's the time to prove it to the world.
You then wait for the wind of your truth to flood the room, and there you have it. The sinners see the error of their ways, hope and reason have been restored, everybody claps, everybody cheers, and the world can go back to the way it was. Thank you, Hollywood.
I think he absolutely nails it. And if, again, you take as a given, at least for, this Hollywood's grip on the public imaginary has receded considerably. It's sort of tried to switch into streaming land, but I should pull up another video that I found. And this video I watched on the way out, flying out to, it was to Synod. This was the video. I'm sure lots of you will hate it, but I thought it was actually very good. Algo served it up to me. How the left lost the internet. And I think she made a great point. Now, part of what, and I'll put the link below for this here too. Gosh, I'm running out of time. I really wanted to just walk through this entire video from like Stories of Old, because I thought he made terrific points.
I've been feeling a little disillusioned with some Hollywood movies lately. It's no secret that many Hollywood movies are grounded within a more liberal worldview. For the sake of discussion, let's define it as the progressive aspiration towards more socio-economic and environmental justice. Or even more simply put, it's pretty much what your average hero in a modern Disney movie stands for, which is a worldview I'd normally align myself with, but also one that has been increasingly revealing itself to be rather impotent in a time of crisis, stubbornly holding on to principles that are based not in reality but in fantasy. Journalists like Ezra Klein have recently written about this too.
And it's interesting how the impact of Ezra Klein and his book Abundance on this. Part of what I've re-listened to most of the Peter Thiel, Ross Douthat interview, and part of the thing that I keep coming back to is whenever you words, remember, religion is that which you consider highest and how to get there. And better is never just plain better. And again, it's part of why I like the Thiel interview, because Thiel was speaking in a way that sort of challenged, better would be the United Nations outlawing nuclear weapons. Thiel mentioned this movie in his, basically the idea was, this was from 1946, the bomb had been there, and we've got to do something about nuclear proliferation, because once everyone has nukes, then cities are going to get nuked and it's going to be horrible. And so what we really need to do is pass laws against them. And I remember doing some reading in the interwar period, because this was movies made in 1946, and this was a big point that was made in the 20s and 30s, that, the League of Nations, we're going to outlaw war. Oh, okay. Why don't we just outlaw evil? How well does that work? Because as soon as you talk about law, you're going to need law enforcement, because human beings are natural-born law breakers or natural-born law cheaters.
The problem of what has also been referred to as lawn sign liberalism, of liberal thought containing serious discrepancies between belief and action, which are now expressing themselves in Hollywood movies as a series of outdated storytelling tropes. Like...
Do you know the oldest lie in America, Senator? It's that power can be innocent.
Liberal Hollywood does not like power. Or more specifically, it doesn't like aspiring leaders who express an explicit will to power.
The men who are dangerous are the ones who do want it.
Actively seeking out self-empowerment is fine when you're like an athlete striving to win a big competition. But in positions of leadership and influence, positions where people can wield significant power over others, that's where it gets tricky.
Desire to become a superhuman cannot be separated from supremacist ideals.
And of course, you can tie this easily into Douthit and Thiel's video as well, because Thiel's version of transhumanism, well, aren't Christians seeking transformation from creation 1.0 to creation 2.0? Our resurrected bodies will be glorious. They'll be spiritual bodies, and by spiritual, it isn't necessarily meant immaterial. And as Thiel says, it's not just our, trans people want their genitalia transformed, but Christian people want themselves transformed in far deeper and more powerful ways. But what exactly is that transformation that has to go on? Now, he does a wonderful job. I love this whole video. I'm going to watch it again, and if I have time to sort of walk through it, I will walk through it. But the best leader doesn't want to lead. I mean, that's a common thing, and that's a pretty good idea generally, but he nicely sort of runs through it.
To be this age and still not know yourself. Ambition, the moth of holiness.
Spoilers incoming, but in the end, the new pope is not the guy who claimed he didn't want it while secretly wanting it a lot. It's also not the main character who wanted it less, but who kinda let himself entertain the idea once the opportunity arose. No, the pope that is ultimately chosen, the pope that Conclave deems we need, is the one who absolutely and most genuinely wanted it the least.
Quo nomine vis vocari.
And I used to make this comparison about my father. My father was a wonderful man. My father was a godly man. My father was a humble man. There are many positions that my father would not work well in because he had a certain list of gifts. Sometimes you need ambitious people in certain positions that can really do them well, but everyone has within them, they're going to have to deal with their own internal ambitions. And the fact that we use this one little word power for so many different things. I mean, lately I've sort of, there's a thread on CRC Voices entitled Power, and it's like, okay, but there's so many different kinds of power. And power has sort of become Andy Crouch wrote about this a while ago now. Power has sort of become a dirty word, but in almost every organization, when, men are said to pushing other men up the hierarchy to do things, we want them to do things because we believe they're capable of doing things and gifted of doing things, and we want things to get done with these. And this is why you have elections. This is why you work on that. So the best leader doesn't want to lead.
Innocentius.
And to me, this just feels like a complete 180 that turned what could have been a constructive critique of the problem of modern liberalism into one of its most glaring and most self-indulgent examples. And despite still liking the movie quite a bit, I specifically wanted to call this one out because it does feel so indicative of just how deep this contradiction is rooted within liberal thought. That when faced with the facade, for some reason, the knee-jerk response is to double down, to say that the problem is not that there is a facade, but that it's just not convincing enough. It implicitly argues that having even the vaguest hint of a will to power means that you're compromised, that you're a stain on true liberalism and must therefore be filtered out to make way for the real liberals who really have no ambition at all.
Bran has no interest in ruling, and he can't father children.
Good.
What we need, according to this liberal fantasy, are pure, unburdened souls who are truly free of this horrible sin, and who therefore are the only...
And of course, well, where would this come from? Well, of course it comes from Jesus, because with Jesus you get someone who rules the universe, but is completely good and completely humble and completely self-sacrificial. And we tend to find in real human beings a lot short of Jesus. And I'm not saying Jesus isn't a real human being. Just let me be clear on that. And I remember Tim Keller talking about one of the differences between the Lord of the Rings movies and the books. He said, what you see in the Lord of the Rings movies is Aragorn just always, oh, I don't want it, I don't want it, I don't want it. And so again, in our liberal filter, it's like, oh, we can trust him because he doesn't want it. And Tim Keller makes the observation in the book, that's not Aragorn at all. Of course he wants it. This is his destiny. He was born to rule. He's the rightful king of Gondor. He is going to, when the time is right, step into the throne and rule. And of course, I just wrote a little screed on a certain comment section. And, the irony of this, Jacob and my friends Jacob and Mark, doesn't evade me because, of course, this is a lot of what, when I was fired by Jacob, and a lot of the criticism I got from Jacob and Mark was, come on, Paul, lead in this way. Oh, no. And Rod Hare will make these kind of comments about me too. Now, hey, fair enough. But at the same time, I also have to decide, well, how exactly am I gifted? And what exactly is my vision for the kinds of things I would like to participate in and promote and create? And so those are things as well. Man, there's just so little time, but it's...
Ones who can cast the first stone. The only ones who, again, are truly
Innocentius.
It's essentially an argument for a kind of ideological and moral Puritanism, the implications of which have greatly affected...
Now, that word Puritanism, people, come on. You might say some sort of purity spiral, but I'm not sure that using Puritan in that frame is terribly historical.
Affected how modern liberalism has worked, or rather, how it has failed to work towards its own aspirations for societal change, where, instead of taking meaningful action, the common response seems to have become...
I agree, but not like this. Liberal fantasy
I'm not going to stop the wheel. I'm going to break the wheel.
Liberal Hollywood does not like radical action. It's become that all too familiar trope. You'll have a character trying to bring about real societal change, and who seems somewhat morally justified in doing so. But then, suddenly, they go on killing a bunch of innocent civilians to remind us they are actually the villain, and so that the actual hero can then step in to say,
I agree with your fight. I just can't get with the way you're fighting it.
There's the obvious implication here that radical action inevitably leads to some kind of moral corruption. That if you cling too strongly to a certain end, at some point you will no longer care about the means to achieve it. And that's a surefire path to violence and evil.
And that is not a bad observation, that in fact, once, means justify ends. And of course, the video that Kale just made is, yeah, it's sort of easy to deal with Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the abstract. But if you had a much more embodied experience of the devastation that these nuclear weapons wrought on these people, well, you might feel differently about these weapons, and then you might say, let's all pitch together and have a one world tyrannical government to save us from nuclear weapons. But the problem is, okay, maybe you're saved from nuclear weapons, but via combinatorial explosiveness, how much do you have to suffer in order to not die from nuclear weapons? And the truth is, we've, at least at this point, since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not had nuclear exchanges in the world. And so the world is just that big and that complex. Oh, this whole video was really good. I really enjoyed this video. And well, he's been reading Abundance. Well, we'll just play a little bit.
They're not innocent. They're roadblocks in my journey, and I'd kill them again if I had to.
Wow.
As with the will to power, it is a somewhat understandable concern in positions of great influence, as becoming too fixated on a certain ambition definitely puts you at risk of losing sight of its true cost.
This is too much power for one person.
I've got to find this man, Lucius.
And so having certain checks and balances in place is generally a good thing. But, as we also saw with the will to power, the pendulum can swing too far in the other direction too, turning a concern with the means into an obsession that ultimately loses sight of what end they were supposed to serve in the first place. It's basically an extension of those unrealistic standards of ideological or moral purity, of that notion that every impact on the world doesn't just have to be reasonably considered. No, it has to be completely free of any trade-off or compromise. It has to be completely
Innocentius.
But in reality, what this really leads to is just an excessive proceduralism that only knows how to say no, that will consider an action, stop at the first sign of even the mildest complication, and be like,
I agree with your fight. I just can't get with the way you're fighting it.
It's the idea that we need to radically change the world, but also we can't inconvenience anyone, we can't upset anything. Which reflects a kind of liberal complacency that, while once being born out of valid concerns, is now actively preventing meaningful progress from being made, and that can sometimes even be downright hypocritical in its implications. For example, as Ezra Klein wrote in his book Abundance, in much of San Francisco you can't walk 20 feet without seeing a multicolored sign declaring that Black Lives Matter, kindness is everything, and no human being is illegal. Those signs sit in yards zoned for single families, in communities that organize against efforts to add new homes that will bring those values closer to reality. To be clear, as Klein also adds, it's not so much individuals that are the problem here. Rather, it's the bureaucratic institutions and procedural dogmas that have arisen around them, and that over time...
So in other words, individuals can't be trusted, but neither can institutions. So nothing can be trusted, so... it's sort of the Hippocratic Oath gone supernova. At least do no harm, so, well, let's not do anything. And then he just basically boils down to and says, about all that liberalism can then finally do is just sort of the activist cry, you should do better. Well, I'm sure I should. But what will that mean? Because... in almost every real-life world situation, especially if you're in leadership, trade-offs are going to require costs. And you don't get everything. And this gets into some theological points, and I am out of time. I wish I could keep going in this, but I will just, all the links are below in the notes. Go ahead and click on them. I thought this was a tremendous video. And from like stories of old, to me, again, it's just showing that we're in this period now where even a channel that has been as blue church as like stories of old, there's a reassessment going on and people are asking questions, and what a world. So, yeah, leave a comment.